The Tall Whites' secret agenda exposed. In 1965, Airman Charles Hall was assigned to a remote desert facility in Nevada. He wasn't supposed to find life, only weather. Instead, he found them, 7 to 9 foot beings, chalk white, luminous, and completely silent. They weren't invaders. They were residents. And for 2 years, he watched the US military treat them like honored guests. This is the story the government never declassified. The hidden alliance between the US Air Force and the Tall Whites, the technology they traded, and the secret agenda that's still unfolding beneath Nevada's sands. The moment everything changed. The desert air was still when the radio stopped crackling. Charles Hall stood alone outside his weather shack, a few miles beyond the farthest light of Nellis Air Force Base. He adjusted the dial, expecting static to fade in, but instead, everything went silent. The night was so quiet that even the sand seemed to listen. Then, something shimmered on the dunes. A white glow, too tall to be a man, shifted across the ridge line watching. Hall froze. He'd been cleared for weather observations, not whatever this was. He gripped his clipboard, trying to rationalize it. Mirage, headlights, maybe a flare. But the glow moved in slow, measured steps, and the air around it bent like heat waves. The silence deepened, pressing in his ears, until a single metallic tone rang across the desert. Not from any vehicle he knew, not from his radio. The hair on his arms lifted. Right then, Hall realized something. This wasn't a human presence. And more disturbingly, he sensed that someone in command already knew he'd see it. To understand how a young airman stumbled into one of the strangest alleged encounters in US military history, you have to go back to 1965, and to the man whose testimony still drives this case, Airman Charles Hall. The Cold War was peaking, and every unexplained light in the sky could be more than rumor. Nellis Air Force Base, hidden in Nevada's endless dry ranges, had become a center for classified testing and unspoken cooperation. Officially, it was a training ground. Unofficially, it hosted programs even most officers hadn't heard of. Witnesses from Hall's unit would later confirm his assignments, and decades of military documentation place him exactly where his story begins. Amid new aircraft, foreign technology evaluations, and top-secret night operations, and in the middle of it, a 22-year-old weather observer trained to report facts, not theories. Hall's assignment sounded harmless: monitor temperature, humidity, and wind along the bomb ranges. But those ranges spanned some of the most restricted land in America, vast valleys that even senior personnel needed clearance to enter. The locations were remote enough to hide anything or anyone. When Hall first drove out there, he noticed fencing that didn't appear on maps, strange radio codes, and sudden changes in flight patterns overhead. Yet no one ever explained them. Over time, other technicians dropped cryptic hints. They joked about range for Harry, a valley supposedly haunted by tall visitors who looked human until you got close. At first, it was just base lore, the kind of tale soldiers invent to pass quiet nights. But the details were oddly consistent. Pale figures seen moving at dusk, lights rising vertically from the ground, military escorts creeping alongside unmarked craft. Hall was trained to note phenomena, not believe in them. Still, patterns were forming. His shifts were increasingly isolated. His radios sometimes went dead without interference, and the command briefings grew tense whenever range for came up. One night, he watched a security truck idle at a spot where no vehicle should have been. The driver stared toward the desert, not moving. Moments later, 3 luminous forms emerged from the dark, tall, thin silhouettes that turned slightly as if acknowledging the man on duty. None of this fit within military procedure. Yet Hall's logs, if they reached command, were never returned. When he mentioned unusual lights, his supervisor told him simply, "Don't record everything you see." That's when he understood. He wasn't alone out there by accident. He'd been placed there deliberately. Someone wanted an observer who wouldn't ask questions. Those early encounters marked the beginning of a mystery that would follow Hall for decades, corroborated later by service records and base maps matching his descriptions. What he saw, the way the military behaved, and the subtle deference shown around certain desert zones all pointed toward something far beyond conventional technology. Later, in sworn interviews and written testimony, Hall described his visitors as tall whites. They appeared human in outline, but exuded a different energy, a calm intelligence that felt both analytical and ancient. His words became foundational evidence for researchers still trying to decode what the US military might have been protecting in those years. Were they scientists? Diplomats? Intruders? No one at Nellis would say. But whatever their purpose, the Air Force seemed to accommodate it. Hall's world, once measured in weather readings, suddenly expanded into something almost cosmic. The shimmer that night was only the beginning. To understand what Hall saw, we have to go back to where it all began, Range 4. Section 1, Nellis Desert Encounter. The wind at Nellis never really stopped, it just shifted moods. That morning, Hall left base in a battered pickup, a notebook on the seat beside him, driving toward range for where few ever went alone. Command wanted a continuous sequence of meteorological readings across the empty flats. Nothing unusual, except that empty never quite matched what he found out there. The deeper he went into the restricted area, the more the landscape felt watched, quiet in a way that seemed deliberate. Hall was a weather observer, not a dreamer. His job was methodical: deploy a theodolite, track balloons, report data. Numbers didn't lie, and that's what kept him grounded after nights when the desert lights danced in defiance of physics. These weren't the flares or aircraft he'd learned to recognize. The lights rose vertically, darted sideways without inertia, then stopped dead as if gravity didn't exist. The first few times, he convinced himself it was experimental hardware from the inner ranges. But then he noticed their pale outlines, tall figures that sometimes followed him with their gaze. He tried ignoring them. So did the other personnel, at least on paper. Still, conversations in the mess hall always circled back to whispers about range visitors. Someone swore a jeep convoy vanished between checkpoints. Another claimed they'd seen something white cross the runway at Indian Springs with no heat signature. Hall couldn't shake the unease that came with routine patterns of secrecy. He knew Cold War testing made odd things normal, yet this wasn't that kind of secrecy. It was colder, older, sanctioned but unspoken. One evening, while logging sunset readings, he caught movement along a ridge. 3 tall forms stood silhouetted against the fading light. They didn't walk, they glided, effortless and silent, robes or suits catching the last orange hue of dusk. The sight locked him still. He rubbed his eyes, expecting distortion from light fatigue. When he looked again, the figures were gone, replaced by faint footprints that seemed too uniform, too precise, spaced as though measured by machine. That night, his radio failed. Instead of static, only a pressurized hum filled the speaker, a sound almost biological. He adjusted dials, tapped the unit, nothing. The next morning maintenance checked and found no issue. Could have been interference, one technician said, avoiding eye contact. Hall read the subtext, don't ask questions. Days blurred. Weather data kept coming, the same arid readings, the same silence stretching beyond the reach of command towers. Yet every so often, equipment malfunctioned mysteriously, timepieces lost minutes, and the desert would flash white for an instant, like lightning without thunder. Hall kept detailed notes. Clouds don't behave that way, he wrote. Neither do aircraft. The more he documented, the more attention he attracted, not from superiors, but from something else. Once, driving back before dawn, he spotted a humanoid shape standing near a cluster of rocks. Everyone on base called that area the nursery, rumor being it's where the creatures were often seen. He slowed his truck, headlights sweeping across the plain. The figure didn't flinch. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long features and pale, almost luminescent skin. When the lights hit its eyes, they seemed to refract the beam like glass. He froze, heart pounding, though his body felt oddly calm, as if the fear had been switched off. Then, the figure lifted a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, before walking away into the darkness. Back at base, he reported only unidentified movement. The commanding officer signed off wordlessly. That silence said everything. There were no follow-up questions, no ridicule, just a sealed report and a subtle warning in the captain's tone. Stick to the weather, Airman. Hall realized the chain of command already knew. Others had brushed against the same truth. Mechanics told him of lights reflecting off radar domes, but registering no radar returns. A cook once mentioned delivering supplies to a guest wing built beneath a hangar near Range 4, though he'd been blindfolded en route. Then came that chilling briefing before a solo rotation. Maintain your schedule. If you encounter personnel outside protocol, observe proper distance. Nobody clarified what outside protocol meant, but Hall didn't have to guess. The next encounter removed all doubt. Midway through his shift, he heard a faint whine, not mechanical yet perfectly tonal. He looked up and froze. Above him hovered an object roughly the size of a bus, white and featureless, suspended in midair without visible propulsion. Its movement was precise, not drifting but balancing over his position, as if calibrating him. For a moment, the air grew dense, his skin prickling with static. Then, from beneath the craft, 3 tall beings descended slowly. Either stepping or floating, he couldn't tell. They landed without sound. They studied him the way scientists might inspect an animal newly discovered. Their motions were graceful, deliberate, and strangely confident, as if they knew he wouldn't run. One of them spoke, or perhaps transmitted a thought, something like a soft musical tone that struck directly inside his skull. Not painful, just startling. The experience lasted seconds, maybe minutes. When they returned toward the craft, an invisible wave passed through the sand, and they vanished. Back at the shack, the environment returned to normal. Instruments still worked, though his wristwatch had advanced 11 minutes. He filed an incomplete report, handwriting shaking just slightly. There was no place for missing time in Air Force paperwork. He didn't sleep that night. The encounter replayed over and over. How the light had curved around them, how their movements felt calculated yet oddly compassionate. He wasn't sure if they'd spared him or scanned him. From that day, small signals confirmed his unspoken suspicion. Security patrols started showing up near his station right after sunset, lingering until dawn. Thrumming sounds echoed across the valley some nights, synchronized like machinery beneath the ground. One technical sergeant, after a few drinks, let slip that some guests used the far ridge for travel, protected under diplomatic protocols. The man laughed it off, but his eyes betrayed fear. Hall noted every detail in the margins of his notebook. He'd come to Nellis to measure weather, but what he was recording now had nothing to do with atmospheric fronts. Something had embedded itself within the military machine, too big to confront, too intelligent to reveal fully. Every step, every controlled contact suggested organization, rules governing the presence of these beings. Weeks later, headquarters reassigned him permanently to Range 4, the very place rumored to host the visitors. Officially, it was simple logistics. He'd proven reliable in isolation. Unofficially, he understood the unspoken reason. Someone wanted him there precisely because he'd seen them and hadn't panicked. The trust was mutual silence. When he signed his orders, the base adjutant said quietly, "Follow procedures, stay in the lanes, report conditions only." Then came a slight pause. "And remember, some things out there aren't ours." That statement echoed louder than any classified code. Hall left the office knowing he was walking into something beyond meteorology, a new formation where science ended and secrecy began. The desert ahead seemed wider now, not just sand and heat, but corridors of the unknown. Days later, his orders changed, and so did the rules. Section 2, establishing contact. Range for Harry stretched far beyond the reach of radio towers, where the dunes rolled like bronze waves and silence earned command over every sound. When Hall took over full-time duty there, the pickup was stocked with supplies for 10 days, plus one new addition, a laminated sheet of field safety protocols. It read like survival notes: maintain visual distance, no sudden gestures, avoid vocal volume escalation, respect designated lanes. There was no signature line, no explanation, and half of the instructions seemed unrelated to any known military procedure. Hall drove out before sunrise. As the sky paled, the valley shimmered in mirrored layers. The heat hadn't arrived yet, but the air already trembled with the same electrical tension he'd felt that first night. He parked near a low ridge that overlooked an expanse of cracked soil dotted with markers painted white. According to his map, those were reference points for weather balloons, but they formed perfect geometric arcs. Patterns that felt planned, not accidental. For 2 days, he saw nothing unusual. Measurements, reports, routine. Then near dusk on the 3rd, movement flickered near the far boundary. For tall figures glided along the marked path, their elongated limbs catching the dying light. Hall froze by instinct, but remembered the sheet's calm directives. He stood still, clipboard down, heart pounding loud enough to feel through his boots. One of the beings paused, turning toward him. The eyes, faintly luminous, seemed to weigh not just his presence, but his intent. They approached in slow precision until they stopped roughly 30 meters away. Hall lifted a cautious hand, a neutral greeting soldiers used among patrols. The tallest figure mirrored the motion with a slight delay, as though determining meaning. Then came a strange hush inside his head. It wasn't a sound, more like a clear awareness carrying a single phrase that wasn't a word, safe. His shoulders loosened before he could question why. He didn't feel scanned or invaded, only observed. Minutes passed. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving faint depressions in the sand, deeper than footprints should have been. That encounter shifted everything. Hall wasn't debriefed that week, an anomaly on its own. Technicians dropped by with crates labeled station upgrades, which turned out to be fresh transmitters he wasn't authorized to install. Each night, he sensed more patrols circling unseen. A rhythm had formed between his solitude and their appearances, like the pulse of two adjacent systems learning to coexist. A few nights later, contact advanced. Hall awoke in his small shelter to a metallic chime echoing outside. The temperature had dropped sharply, frost glinting under a hazy moon. He stepped out, and 3 of them stood near the marker posts, motionless. The light from their clothing shifted hues, pale blue to soft gold, like an aura following pulse beats. The tallest one raised an object, elbow length, ridged like coral. With a dim vibration, the wind around Hall softened, and his breath no longer misted in the cold. That was when comprehension arrived without words. Ideas, sequences, impressions about temperature balance and wave harmonics filled his head as if downloaded. He stumbled back, overwhelmed by understanding shapes instead of sentences. When the figures receded, the air snapped back to the chill of midnight. Hall noted the event mechanically, as though instinctively following training for something unspoken. His instruments had recorded no temperature swing, no wind deviation, yet his skin told another story. The next morning, a security jeep idled a few hundred feet away, tinted windows up. Nobody stepped out, but the message was clear. He was seen, managed, contained. Soon after, further procedures arrived printed in red. Do not attempt unauthorized communication. Remain calm during nocturnal observation. Report only meteorological data. Hall laughed softly reading it. Calm was the only choice left when surrounded by forces that could unmake fear itself. Over weeks, the pattern became formalized. Dusk appearances, silent exchanges, soft pulses of light. The visitors sometimes trailed mechanical devices, small orbs hovering waist-high, moving with insect precision. Once, one of the devices settled near Hall's theodolite. It emitted a thread of white light scanning the instrument, then projected a geometric hologram above the sand, 3 concentric spheres rotating within each other. When he reached out, the image flickered out like breath on glass. The beings nearby seemed content with his reaction, slight nods betraying something akin to approval. The more exposure Hall had, the more deliberate his placement appeared. Supply manifests always included extra rations that nobody claimed responsibility for. Replacement batteries arrived before he requested them. At times, his own field reports returned from headquarters with altered timestamps. It felt less like oversight, more like orchestration, a puzzle where he was the living variable. Emotionally, curiosity replaced fear. Hall likened it to standing beside an avalanche that had already decided not to bury you. He couldn't explain why he trusted them, but every measured gesture, every exchange of thought carried an undercurrent of control without cruelty. They weren't probing for dominance, they were gauging compatibility. Still, tension simmered. Once, while tracking humidity changes, bright flares erupted across the ridge, military signal rounds. A convoy approached, headlights blacked out except for infrared markers. From the haze emerged a team of airmen in desert camouflage, escorting 2 of the tall beings. Their posture was protective toward the aliens, not the other way around. One human shouted, "Remain in your lane." Hall obeyed, stepping aside as they passed toward a slope where an enormous oval object rested half-buried. Its surface was smooth as bone. Technicians moved with studied efficiency, plugging cables from ground generators into recesses that glowed faint blue. Hall realized he was witnessing maintenance, not of a human craft, but theirs. After the convoy left, he walked the site quietly. The sand radiated residual warmth, rhythmic like breathing beneath his boots. He wanted to believe it was machinery venting heat, yet a faint hum still carried through the night. Recording it felt futile. No device would capture frequencies half beyond perception. Hall's relationship with the visitors evolved into silent coexistence. He began anticipating their arrival through subtle temperature drops and faint tonal harmonics in the distance. Once, one of the younger ones, smaller, perhaps childlike, stepped closer than usual, mirrored his handwriting motion in the air, then retreated under a stern glance from the taller guides. The hierarchy was obvious, and even their discipline mirrored military order. Fear returned only fleetingly, in moments of solitude, when he'd replay the impossibility of it all. If these beings existed with such mastery of physics, what did they want here among soldiers and dust? They never took resources, never demanded submission. Yet the U.S. Air Force behaved as if hosting royalty. Hall sensed agreements older than his assignment, an established protocol balancing curiosity with caution. The desert was their embassy, and he was the accidental attaché. He learned subtle signals, how a certain hand tilt meant farewell, a low hum indicated observation mode. Once during a sandstorm, one appeared beside his shelter, using a narrow rod that emitted a shimmering field deflecting the gust like an invisible wall. The figure waited until the wind subsided, then simply nodded and vanished into the cobalt twilight. Gratitude and dread blurred together. He felt protected, but owned. Eventually, his reports changed tone. Numbers still filled the pages, but margins carried impressions. The way light bent around them, their measured patience, the quiet authority in their gestures. Each entry deepened his conviction that both species were learning boundaries in real time. The Air Force acted as moderator. He was data collector and participant alike. At headquarters, briefings tightened, shorter, colder, reduced to logistics. Hall noticed new officers with insignia he didn't recognize, their insignias adorned by subtle silver motifs. Questions about his emotional state replaced technical ones. "Are you managing stress, Airman?" one asked with mechanical concern. He knew these weren't psychiatrists. They were evaluators ensuring neutrality under extraordinary contact. Then the routine shifted. An envelope without markings instructed him to continue Phase 2 engagement. It contained coordinates deeper than any location he'd been cleared for. The document ended with 5 words that encapsulated both trust and warning. "They will acknowledge you now." As he folded the paper, the desert outside seemed to inhale. Hall sensed that the controlled observation phase was over. The next would be communication, directed and intentional. The contact that once unfolded by accident was now policy. But the Air Force wasn't just letting this happen, they were managing it. Section 3. The military's hidden protocols. On paper, Rangefor existed only as another weather testing sector inside Nellis. In reality, it was an island of silence ringed by invisible borders. After Hall's formal integration into that zone, he noticed subtle shifts in how orders reached him. Messages no longer came by routine radio. Now they arrived through short-range encrypted bursts from a relay truck. His debriefs were relocated to a small office inside a hangar guarded by men who wore no unit patches. Even the smell was different inside, ozone machine oil, something sterile, like a hospital that never saw sunlight. During those meetings, language changed. Officers who once spoke plainly now layered their words in code. Any mention of meteorological anomalies clearly meant encounters. Guest logistics referred to craft maintenance. Human interface described briefings with personnel exposed to the beings. Hall realized that he wasn't attending weather reviews. He was being measured for compliance. Everything that had felt spontaneous in the desert was in fact governed by a framework invisible to most of the base. Secrecy-fed structure. Range safety maps suddenly carried shaded zones marked as diplomatic corridors. Pilots received orders to avoid those airspaces under penalty of grounding. Ground convoys diverted miles around them without explanation. When Hall asked a transport sergeant why, the man muttered, "Foreign clearance," and refused eye contact. The phrase lingered, foreign clearance for whom? Inside the base, talk of range for Harry never went beyond whispers. One mechanic joked about needing a passport to move through that sector before quickly retracting the comment when a security officer entered the room. Hall recognized the tension of compartmentalization, where everyone knew fragments of the truth, but no one dared connect them. Information was rationed by rank and by emotional stability. The few allowed persistent access were chosen for 2 traits, composure and loyalty. Hall possessed both and, as he later understood, that made him an ideal observer. The Air Force didn't deny the existence of the visitors, it redefined them. Official phrasing cast them as external consultants under non-terrestrial authority. Hall found the term printed once at the top of a heavily redacted bulletin pinned in the comms trailer. It vanished 2 hours later. Within days, the bulletin board itself was replaced. When he asked about it, officers smiled thinly and changed topics. Such replacements happened often, new equipment appearing overnight, manifests unsigned, trucks idling near hangars marked temporarily closed. From his post, Hall noticed how training flights altered schedules depending on unseen activities in the valley. Whenever the luminous craft were expected, daytime exercises shifted north toward Tonopah. Radar teams were temporarily reassigned to maintenance. Whole sections of airspace would blink off the navigation grid for 12-hour intervals. Those patterns weren't coincidences. They were evidence of coordination between human command and something that required secrecy beyond any Cold War weapon. He began comparing it with known black projects. Rumors about Program Constant Peg, where US pilots secretly flew Soviet jets, had whispered through the canteen months earlier.